This week, we're covering chapters 17 through 24 of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And you'll notice that the further south on the Mississippi River that Huck and Jim go, the more they're exposed to worse and worse examples of human depravity. Remember that we've talked before about how one of the things that Mark Twain is doing with this story is bringing to light what's bad and what's dark in human nature through the eyes of a child who is, for the most part, innocent. And he's already encountered some bad natures up until this point in the story. The robbers on the shipwreck and so on. But now his encounters with people who live along the river just afford us a bleaker outlook of humanity each time. It's almost like Dante's depiction of the descent into hell. It just gets worse and worse. So first we meet the Grangerfords, who are in a decades-long family feud with another family who lives nearby, the Shepherdsons. Huck is taken into the Grangerford family, and initially they seem like a loving, compassionate, and civil household. They tell Huck that he can live with them. He makes friends with their youngest son, Buck, and they're even well-to-do financially. It's almost like this idyllic scene, except, of course, to the eyes of modern readers, they're a family of slave owners. But of course, our judgment about the Grangerfords is skewed when we discover that they have this deadly feud going on. No one remembers why the conflict started, at least the younger generation doesn't. And these two groups of people are periodically killing each other in an almost impersonal way. There's no bad feelings, just bad blood. It's what's always been done. And this is reminiscent of a real-life family feud that was going on at the time in America, and which is still well known and talked about today, that between the Hatfields and McCoys. These were two families who lived in the West Virginia, Kentucky area, and they initially started feuding over a pig. And later on, when one of the Hatfields developed an interest in one of the McCoy daughters, just like what happens in Huckleberry Finn, the feud got even more serious. And that conflict actually lasted for about 20 years, and dozens of people ended up dead. Actually, I think it was closer to 60. And what's interesting is that this was happening around the exact same time that Twain was writing Huckleberry Finn in the 1880s. And Twain never cited the Hatfield and McCoy conflict as inspiration for these chapters. It's possible that he didn't know about it. Although I guess there's no reason to think that he couldn't have read about it in papers of the day either. If he didn't know about it, then that's one big coincidence, especially since some of the details that he includes in the novel mirror the real-life conflict so accurately. But Twain might have been more inspired by literary precedents. Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which gets mentioned a few chapters later, and that play also depicts two feuding families and two young lovers from each family who are kept apart by the hatred. The idea of feuding clans or families is popular in literature, and for good reason, because it shows how genuinely good people can be brought to commit evil acts for reasons that, when we look at them objectively, are really silly. And I think that one of the things that Twain is trying to do here is to highlight the irrationality of feuds and of long-standing hatreds generally. How they can make friendly, kind-hearted adolescents like Buck suddenly turn into bloodthirsty killers on a dime. One minute he's a child doing childish things with Huck, and then he's taking shots at one of the Shepherdsons from behind a bush. It's like this switch gets flipped and he becomes a killer. And the whole family of the Grangerfords seem to be rather noble, caring, and literary, not ones we would imagine to be inclined to senseless violence. But of course, once the fighting starts, they turn into savages, just like their opponents. And the feud ends up destroying them. Huck has to watch as his friend is shot down and the rest of the Grangerfords are killed when things dissolve into a gunfight by the river. And this affects him in a way that nothing else has so far in the narrative. He's done a pretty good job of impersonally relating the bad things that have happened to him so far, telling us about Pap's depravity and about robbers and slave hunters and so on. But when we get to this part of the story, Huck wants to cut it short. He says this as he's describing Buck's death. He says, all of a sudden, bang, 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 goes 3 or 4 guns. The men had slipped around through the woods and come in from behind without their horses. The boys jumped for the river, both of them hurt, and as they swam down the current, the men run along the bank shooting at them and singing out, kill them, kill them. It made me so sick I most fell out of the tree. I ain't a-going to tell all that happened. It would make me sick again if I was to do that. I wished I hadn't ever come ashore that night to see such things. I ain't ever going to get shut of them. Lots of times, I dream about them. So, and then, he says that this is some sort of, that it is a traumatic event that he's never going to get loose of. And he describes how he goes down and pulls Buck's body out of the river and cries as he's tending to the corpse. And then immediately after that, he returns to the raft with Jim, and they continue on down the river. And we get a sense of peace that comes after this violent episode. It's as if Huck has returned to this sort of Edenic state on the river after venturing through all of the evil and the depravity on the shoreline. And this is one of the things that the river symbolizes in the novel. It's an escape from the contamination of human society and a return to the freedom from pollution that nature offers. And that's, if you remember, it's a thought that we saw when we were reading Thoreau. And actually, it comes out in Hawthorne a bit as well. Well, this escape doesn't last too long, because pretty soon afterwards, we meet 2 characters whose real names are a mystery, but they go by the Duke and the King, and they become Huck and Jim's traveling companions. They're con artists who have separately practiced dozens of different ways to con well-meaning people out of their money. The Duke is the younger and more clever of the 2, and he's an amateur actor and performer. The King is older, and he poses as an itinerant preacher in order to scam people out of their offerings at revival meetings. There were a lot of itinerant preachers during this time, also known as circuit riders, from a number of different denominations, but mostly Methodists, who would travel alone through the countryside and host revival meetings in churches or at campsites like the one that we see in the story. And this was during one of the many periods of religious revivals in the country, collectively called the Great Awakening. Actually, there were several periods of different Great Awakenings. This would have been during the time of the second or the third. So anyway, the Duke and the King have their separate trades of chicanery, and Huck goes to see firsthand how they take money from people. By the way, the reason that they go by the Duke and the King is because they want Huck and Jim to treat them like royalty and to do whatever they say. And because they're both vain and self-important. No other reason, really. The King is actually claiming to be the son of Louis XVI, who was beheaded during the French Revolution. Huck and Jim had already discussed this historical character before, a few chapters back. And actually, maybe that discussion was laying the groundwork for this encounter that they're having now, when they were talking about kings, King Solomon, and so on. It doesn't take Huck long to figure out that these 2 are frauds, though. Jim seems to be taken in, but Huck realizes pretty soon that they're not who they say that they are. And the reason that Huck doesn't disillusion Jim, his reasoning is a bit amusing. He says that they act just like how real kings and dukes do act. So there's not really any reason to point out the lie here. And this is another way that Twain shows us a bit of the adult world through the eyes of a child, and by doing that he sheds a new particular light on it. How is a duke or a king different from a common scammer or a robber. They take everyone's money, they're self-interested and self-important, and they cause chaos just because they're bored. Real kings and dukes even start wars out of boredom, Huck reasons. And so it's interesting that Twain is making this social commentary through Huck and his interaction with the fake Duke and the King. One other interesting episode that I want to talk about is the mob scene. So the Duke and the King stop in a town in order to put on a show and get money from people, and Huck goes wandering around the town with them. And while he's exploring, he sees a drunken man get shot down in the street by a serious, no-nonsense guy named Sherburne. And the story has made clear that the drunken man was harmless. He was threatening to do the same thing to Sherburne, but everyone was just laughing him off, saying that he says that to everybody. He's kind of the village joke. So Sherburne's fighting back and actually killing him, shooting him down cold-blooded, is looked on by the town with a certain amount of outrage. And a few people say that they should lynch Sherburne for what he's done. A mob forms and they swarm over to his house. Sherburne steps out onto his front porch holding his rifle, and then he laughs at them all. Now, Mark Twain, he's already shown us the absurdity of a feud. And here he highlights the absurdity of a mob. And I almost think, that he seems to be speaking through Sherburne, who is himself something of a despicable character, but here Twain's using him as his mouthpiece. The character gives a little bit of a lecture here. And, I'll read the length of it because I think it's really insightful. As Sherburne's looking down at the crowd, he says, "The idea of you lynching anybody, it's amusing. The idea of you thinking you had pluck enough to lynch a man. Because you're brave enough to tar and feather poor friendless cast-out women that come along here, did that make you think you had grit enough to lay your hands on a man? Why, a man's safe in the hands of 10,000 of your kind, as long as it's daytime and you're not behind him. Do I know you? I know you clear through. I was born and raised in the South, and I've lived in the North, so I know the average all around. The average man's a coward. In the North, he lets anybody walk over him that wants to, and goes home and prays for a humble spirit to bear it. In the South, one man, all by himself, has stopped a stage full of men in the daytime and robbed the lot. Your newspapers call you a brave people so much that you think you are braver than any other people, whereas you're just as brave and no braver. Why don't your juries hang murderers? Because they're afraid the man's friends will shoot them in the back in the dark, and it's just what they would do. So they always acquit, and then a man goes in the night with 100 masked cowards at his back and lynches the rascal. Your mistake is that you didn't bring a man with you. That's one mistake, and the other is that you didn't come in the dark and fetch your masks. You brought part of a man, Buck Harkness, there, and if you hadn't had him start you, you'd have taken it out in a blowing. You didn't want to come. The average man don't like trouble and danger. You don't like trouble and danger. But if only half a man, like Buck Harkness there, shouts, lynch him, you're afraid to back down, afraid you'll be found out to be what you are, cowards. And so you raise a yell and hang yourselves onto that half a man's coattail and come raging up here, swearing what big things you're going to do. The pitifulest thing out is a mob. That's what an army is, a mob. They don't fight with courage that's born in them, but with courage that's borrowed from their mass and from their officers. But a mob without any man at the head of it is beneath pitifulness. So, the average man is a coward, he says. And we can actually see this idea playing out in real time whenever there's some sort of a riot taking place on the news. People know that there's safety in numbers, and they'll do things as part of a mob that they would never do if they were being held fully responsible for their own actions. People use riots in order to rob stores, settle personal vendettas, and commit all sorts of outrages, just chaos for chaos' sake. And later on, seeing the collective damage that's been done, they might repent for the part that they played in it. But it's almost like people come under a sort of spell or something. And we even have a name for it, mob mentality. And Twain is deriding that here. He's saying that you're a coward if you participate in those sort of things. That if you're a real man or woman, you'll fight your battles on your own. So that will be it for this week. Next time, read chapters 25 through 32. Thanks.